day. Today is Tuesday, 1st October, and I propose at the start of this program, for the greater part of this program, to focus on the situation in Ukraine, on the conflict there, and only then return to the situation in the Middle East. I say that because it's clear that Israel is beginning some kind of ground operation. Israeli officials have been trying to play down its scale and importance, which begs the question in that case of what this ground operation is for. But because we are at a relatively early stage in what I suspect will be now a protracted conflict, and I think it might be a moment to step back a little and to assess the problems more deeply. I will, as I said, return to this topic later in this program, but let's turn first to the situation in Ukraine, where we are getting increasingly dramatic news from the battlefronts. And the most dramatic news, possibly of all, is information that there has been a collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Vuhledar. There are even some reports circulating as I make this program, which claim that all Ukrainian resistance in Vuhledar has effectively ceased or has ceased, and that the entire town, every part of it, is under Russian control. Now, I cannot confirm that at this time, at this particular moment on this program, but one thing is indisputable, and that is that we have now had lots of pictures of Russian troops, both in eastern and western Vuhledar, and bear in mind, in terms of its area, this is a small place, very dense town, lots of high-rise buildings, but the area, as I said, is actually relatively small. Well, anyway, we've had pictures of Russian troops raising Russian flags, and by the way, the Soviet victory banner, in various parts of Vuhledar, both in the east and in the west. And the interesting fact about these flag-raising events is that they're happening with no sound or appearance of any fighting going on anywhere close to where the Russian troops are raising these flags. As I said, to repeat once more, this is a small town in terms of its area. If there was intense fighting going on, if there was bombing and missile strikes by the Russians taking place in the way that we have seen happen earlier in the conflict, then one would expect, or I would expect, at least some visible appearance of fighting. The fact that this isn't happening, that there is no such appearance in these films, does suggest to me that fighting has effectively ceased. That doesn't mean that there has been a capitulation by the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar. It doesn't mean that there is a formal ceasefire in place, but it may mean that, in effect, resistance has ended and that no one on the Ukrainian side any longer is interested in fighting back. Now, all of that, if that is true, suggests that we are literally in the final hours. Final hours either before there is a mass surrender or before the Russian troops occupy all the remaining buildings where Ukrainian troops were located, and any Ukrainian troops who put up resistance will presumably be taken care of in the way that happens in war. So, Vuhledar, the Battle of Vuhledar, one of the longest battles of the conflict, has ended. Now, I should say I'm not clear who the Russian general, who is in overall charge of the fighting around Vuhledar, is. I'm not even completely sure which army group is involved in the fighting around Vuhledar. It is not apparently General Mordvichev's army group center. But whoever the general is, he has conducted this operation with great skill ever since he was put in charge, presumably around a year ago. It has been conducted in a systematic, methodical, incremental way. There's been none of the attempts that the Russians made earlier in the fighting to capture Vuhledar through a head-on advance. Instead, we've seen the Russians move purposefully, capturing first the village of Novomikhailivka, then breaking through to the road linking Konstantinovka with Vuhledar, in effect interrupting Ukrainian logistics. Then the Russians moving on to capture Konstantinovka, the village beyond Novomikhailivka, the one that sits astride the main supply road. Then the Russians crossing the supply road, capturing the village of ODYSEE, storming the two coal mines, South Donbass number 1, South Donbass number 3, and then the Russians also capturing the village of Prichistovka, west of Vuhledar, advancing into the fields north of Vuhledar, cutting the remaining paved supply road and establishing dominance over the country roads, the remaining country roads that the Ukrainians have been trying to use to try to keep the garrison in Vuhledar supplied. So it's been a methodical, systematic, conservative campaign. As I said, no attempt to do anything dramatic or spectacular, but it has delivered the result. It has brought Vuhledar, the once invincible fortress, under full Russian control, and the assault on the actual town itself appears to have been very short. It's just been over. It's been ended in a matter of a few days. So, whoever this general is, he has done, I would say, an exemplary job from a military point of view. The same cannot be said for the Ukrainian command. I discussed this all yesterday in my program. I think that the decision to hold out in Vuhledar to the extent that was done was completely ill-judged. Frankly, when Marinka, the town near Donetsk city, fell in December 2023, it ought to have been obvious at that time that the situation for Vuhledar was becoming increasingly precarious. And once Novomikhailivka fell in the spring of this year, it ought to have been obvious again to the Ukrainian command that the fall of Vuhledar was only a matter of time. And steps should have been taken then to prepare for the evacuation from the town of the troops who were defending it, specifically the 92nd Brigade. But that was not done. And the result was that the Russians continued to advance, capturing all of the places that I have talked about. And even a week ago, 2 weeks ago, it might have been possible to organize some kind of retreat from Vuhledar. But again, that was not done. And between 1,000 and 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers, some of the best soldiers apparently that Ukraine has, were as a result abandoned to their fate. It seems to me an astonishing failure of imagination and leadership on the part of the Ukrainian command. Obviously, Vuhledar would have fallen earlier had they decided to withdraw from it. say 2 or 3 weeks ago, when they still could. But how would that have put the Ukrainians in a worse position than the one they're in anyway? Just saying. Anyway, there we go. Vuhledar either has fallen or is about to fall. It is probably hours before that happens, if it hasn't happened already. Just hours away now. Maybe, as some reports are suggesting, it has already happened. There we are. Now, the Russians are not only focused on Vuhledar in this area. There are reports that the Russian troops are now within a kilometer of Bogoyavlenka itself. So it looks as if they're preparing to attack Bogoyavlenka. And if we're talking about the other villages west of Konstantinovka, the Russians are said to be attacking, or at least pushing towards Katerinovka, Yelizavetivka, Ilinka, Antonivka, these 3 villages to the northwest of Bogoyavlenka. And it looks as if the Russians are also advancing or going to move ultimately towards the village of Novoukrainka, which lies north of Prechestivka. In other words, the Russians very much see Vuhledar as only a step towards a further advance. And presumably, the ultimate objective in this area is Kurakovo. If the Russians capture all of these villages that I've talked about, Yelizavetivka, Antonivka, Yanivka, Katerinivka, all of these places, then the next village further north is a place called Dalnie, and beyond that is Kurakovo itself. And of course, if the Russians capture Novoukrainka, then that brings them very close to the village of Shakhtorsk to the northwest, and another village called Yasna Polyana, but it also brings them astride a road that leads directly to Kurakovo as well. So it looks to me, it probably is the case that the Russians are planning an advance ultimately on Kurakovo. And moreover, and in addition, the capture of Bogoyavlenka enables the Russians to shorten their lines, to link up with their forces that are now located in Marinka and Krasnogorovka, and that will bring the Russians closer still to that position that they no doubt wish to control near Kurakovo itself. The siege, the battle for Kurakovo looks like it is about to begin. So let's now turn to the situation in Kurakovo itself. And here I think one has to say that the situation for the Ukrainians also appears to be extremely bad. Now, a couple of days ago, I said that there were reports that the Russians had advanced from the village of Gostra and had pushed westwards and had in fact reached a village literally on the doorstep of Kurakovo itself, and that in effect this had brought them to the Kurakovo reservoir, that the Russians had already arrived at this place. Now, there's been no official announcement of this from any Russian from the Russian Defense Ministry. And as far as I know, no actual blogger or reporting agency on the Russian side has alluded to this. But I saw that a report on the Russian Defense Ministry's website appeared to refer to this capture of this very place, Ostrivske, on the Kurachovo Reservoir. The account that was given on the Russian Defense Ministry website was that a Russian force, having captured Gostria and then gone on to capture the Selidovo prison, which is located in this area, then simply went on and advanced all the way to Ostrivska, and that there was no Ukrainian defenses or resistance prior to the capture of this village. Now, as I said, this is a strange account that's appeared in the Russian Defense Ministry, but one of the soldiers who supposedly carried out this operation appeared to confirm it and to say that that was precisely what had happened. So it looks as if Ostrivske has been, and perhaps still is, under Russian control. And of course, if that is correct, then we are looking at a major crisis for the Ukrainians. The Russians controlled this place, Ostrivske, Gostry, the prison area. They're in control of most of Maximilianovka, village immediately to the south of these places, immediately to the west of Kurachovo itself. And they're pushing through the village of Girnik to the north. And it looks to me as if villages like Vovchenka, Kurachivka, Alexandropil, Zoryanye, all of these villages are on the brink of encirclement, and that the Russians are very close, therefore, to an advance on Kurachovo from the west as well, even as with the fall of Vuhledar, they could be advancing on Kurachovo from the south, as well. So there we are. It's a complicated, intricate battle. It's not always easy to know exactly what is going on, but it does look as if there is an operational crisis for the Ukrainians on every part of this southern battlefront. In Vuhledar, which, as I said, is probably hours away from falling, if it has not fallen already, from around Kurachovo, the area around Kurachovo itself, where resistance might collapse at some point over the course of the next few weeks. And in this cluster of villages north of the Kurachovo reservoir, northeast of the Kurachovo area, which I have just mentioned. Anyway, let's discuss what's going on in other places too, because the situation further north in Selidovo is also becoming very bad. The Russians, we now have film evidence that the Russians control significant parts now of the village of Tsukurinye, south of Selidovo. This is the village located immediately to the west of Ukrainsk. And there's actually, as I said, there's pictures of Russian troops operating inside this village, Tsukurinye. It's likely that Tsukurinye will fall, perhaps again, within hours. And the Russians, there's also pictures that apparently confirm the presence of the Russians, certainly on the southern outskirts of Selidovo itself, and they appear to be in control of some of the main railway lines leading into Selidovo from the south. There's also some reports that the Russians have pushed further and might be intending to push towards another village west of Selidovo called Vishnieve, which, if true, would mean that Selidovo was literally in a cauldron. And, well, there's still uncertainty about who exactly controls the coal mine and slag heap to the northeast of Selidovo, but apparently there's been film and geolocations provided by the Ukrainians which show Russian troops and armor operating to the west of this coal mine and slag heap, all of which appears to confirm that Selidovo is about to be, or will soon be, encircled. Now, again, the logical thing for the Ukrainian command to do is to pull out of Selidovo as soon as possible. Whether they will do that remains to be seen, but it's clear to me that Selidovo, along with Kurakovo and, of course, Vuhledar, is about to be lost. And further north, we now have confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry that the Russians are in control of Krasny Yar, the village northeast of Novogrodivka. I have no doubt that they're also in control of Grodivka, a village to the northeast of Krasny Yar, of Kruty Yar, sorry, and I have no doubt that they also control the villages of Krasny Yar and Mikhailovka, Nikolaevka, which are located to the north of these places as well. And the Russians are also pushing towards Sukhye Yar and Lisivka to the northwest of Novogrodivka, and they're also pushing from these villages. They're gradually clearing the trench lines that the Ukrainians have created south of Mirnograd, and an attack on Mirnograd, a Russian offensive against Mirnograd and Pokrovsk at some point within the next few weeks, to my mind, is now becoming increasingly likely. The picture I am describing is one of collapse. The Ukrainians, when the Russians arrived in the general territory of Pokrovsk at the end of August, rushed what reserves they still had to the area. They tried to stabilize the situation by sending troops to Selidovo, and for a time they were able to push the Russians back in that town. They tried to make a stand in Grodivka, and there was a bitter battle for that village as well. But it's clear that they only managed to buy themselves a few weeks, that their forces, through this attempt to hold the Russians back, became further depleted. And we see that in the northern area of the Pokrovsk, Kurakovo, Vuhledar battle, Ukrainian forces are collapsing. Ukrainian defenses are collapsing and are now collapsing at speed. In my opinion, the collapse in Selidovo is probably days away, maybe weeks away at most, but it will come very fast. And Kurakovo will probably take a bit longer. The Ukrainian troops there are perhaps at even greater risk of encirclement than they are in Selidovo itself. And once the Russians clear these places, well, the way will be open for an advance on Pokrovsk. And as I said in a recent program, I expect Pokrovsk and Mirnograd to be under Russian control before the end of the year. And at the rate things are going, perhaps much sooner, given the speed of the collapse that we're seeing, given apparently the lack of defenses in the Pokrovsk and Mirnograd area, given the fact that Russian aviation, drones and aircraft dominate the roads leading into Pakrovsk, it's likely, as I said, that the collapse there will come very fast, much faster than many people expect. So that's the situation in this area of the battlefield. The big story today is Vuhledar, but one should not lose sight of the fact that Vuhledar itself is part of a much bigger battle, and it looks as if all parts of that battle are now being won by the Russians and won by them in the most decisive way. Now, victory for the Russians in this battle for Pakrovsk, Vuhledar, Kurachovo opens up all kinds of further opportunities. Obviously, it would mean that the logistics of the Ukrainians in providing supplies for their troops in Chasiv Yar and Konstantinovka will be interrupted. There's been a huge amount said about this, but on top of that, in addition to all of that, the fall of Vuhledar opens up for the opportunities for the Russians to advance in the Zaporozhye and potentially even Kherson areas. With Vuhledar no longer on their flanks, the Russians can push north towards Zaporozhye city, and we're now getting more reports that that is indeed slowly what is starting to happen. A couple of days ago, Vladimir Rogov, our old friend, a member of a political movement in Zaporozhye region, but also somebody who clearly is kept well briefed by the Russian military. Anyway, Vladimir Rogov spoke about a major fortification having been captured by the Russians in the Zaporozhye area. We've now received more reports about where this fortification was located. It appears to have been located west of Orekhov. The Russians are also supposed to be advancing towards Orekhov from the south, from Rabotino, famous village fought over so intensely. I expect that perhaps after the Rasputitsa, after the October rains, the Russians will advance towards Orekhov as well. And if Orekhov is captured by the Russians, the way opens up for a further Russian advance towards the river, towards the Dnieper, and towards the great city of Zaporozhye, one of the major industrial and economic centers of Ukraine, a critical city in terms of Ukraine's defense, but also a city that is part of Zaporozhye, which the Russians now claim as their own, and of course the Russians claim that Zaporozhye itself, therefore, is a city inside Russia, one that they insist the Ukrainians must leave. So, an offensive towards Zaporozhye, perhaps in the last weeks of this year, looks to me like a distinct probability. Well, anyway, that's the situation on the southern battlefronts. In the area of Toretsk, also apparently intense fighting. The Russians captured Nelipivka, village to the south of Toretsk. They're now located deep inside the central area of Toretsk. The Ukrainians claimed some days ago that they'd undertaken a counterattack to push the Russians back in central Toretsk. They instead provided a rather complicated film showing Ukrainian troops planting demolition devices in a particular building, which it was claimed the Russians controlled, the entire episode looked to me, I'm going to say it bluntly, very staged. It showed no evidence of any Ukrainian advance. And I'm starting to get the sense that an increasing number of the videos that the Ukrainians are now producing are videos produced in this kind of way, intended to show advances by the Ukrainians or some kind of operation by the Ukrainians, which when you scratch the surface of the video, it looks unconvincing. Demolition of a building in Toretsk, a building which we only have it from the Ukrainians, was under Russian control, does not look to me like proof of a Ukrainian advance. On the contrary, it suggests that the Ukrainians are now increasingly demolishing buildings in Vuhledar, in Toretsk, like they destroyed the tower building in the coal mine area, in order to slow what looks like an unstoppable Russian advance in the town. And bear in mind, some days ago, the Ukrainians provided film of what they said was another counterattack, and one could see in that film the very tower that the Ukrainians had destroyed about 2 days before, which shows that the film that the Ukrainians released was out of date by the time that they released it. So I think an awful lot of that is going on now, and it makes it particularly important and to be especially careful about the fact that film like that is being released. It doesn't necessarily tell us the reality of what is going on the ground. By the way, let me repeat again that we're talking about a war here. I don't hold it against the Ukrainians that they do this. They need to maintain the morale of their soldiers and of their population. I don't think that releasing film of this kind, staging films of this kind, is a wrong or improper thing to do in a war. All I am saying is be very careful when you watch film like that. Don't assume that what you're seeing is necessarily true. You're being directed to think something which might be profoundly wrong or inaccurate. And by the way, I'm not saying that the Russians haven't done the same thing at various stages in the war also. Anyway, there we are. That's Toretsk. I get the sense that Toretsk, again, the Russians are continuing advances. There's been lots of areas, more areas of Toretsk coloured red, in other words, under Russian control by the various mapping projects since I made my last program. And as for the Ukrainian counterattacks that were supposed to be taking place, judging on this one video, which is supposed to show the results of that counterattack, I think that these counterattacks are the product of someone's imagination. I don't think that they're happening at all. Anyway, that's the situation in Toretsk. There's all sorts of reports and rumors about events taking place in Chasiv Yar and Siversk. I'm not going to spend time trying to analyze them because there's not enough information, in my opinion, to draw any valid conclusions. It just seems to me as if the Russians are continuing to advance in both of these places, and I would not be surprised if at some point over the next few weeks, maybe the next week, we suddenly learn that Ukrainian resistance in Chasiv Yar is also about to collapse. So there we go. And further north in the Kursk area, apparently bitter battles underway at the two villages of Plechovo and Sverdlikovo as the Russians try to close the noose around the Ukrainian troops in Kursk. If the Ukrainian troops are trapped in Kursk, if it becomes a Dien Bien Phu, as I discussed in my program yesterday, a repeat of that operation that the French conducted in the early 1950s in Vietnam, when they tried to defeat the Vietnamese in the First Indochina War by sending troops behind the Vietnamese rear, only to have them surrounded, and after a long and difficult battle, to experience a military collapse. If Kursk turns out to be a repeat of that, well, I am not sure, as I said in my program yesterday, that Zelensky's government will survive that. So there we are. I think that it is not wrong to speak of an accelerating collapse on every part of the front lines. The Ukrainian resistance continues to be very intense in some places. They're still fighting hard in Volchansk, for example, where they supposedly repelled a Russian counterattack in the area of the aggregate plant. They're still fighting, but one senses that their strength is ebbing, and ebbing quickly, even as Russian strength is waxing. And all the indications, incidentally, are that the Russians are going to continue to increase their military power. As many commentators have noticed, the Russians have increased defense spending by a quarter in 2025 over the funds that they're spending today. And there's a long article in The Spectator today, British magazine, once edited by Boris Johnson, which correctly says that the Russians can afford it. In fact, their deficit, their budget deficit, despite wobbles in the oil price, is falling partly because, as the Russian Finance Ministry has pointed out, the share of export revenue to the Russian budget is now in rapid decline. Russia's economy and its taxation system has been rebalanced so that the budget is being funded increasingly from domestic revenue. So there we go. A situation of crisis right across the battle lines, and of course, disappointment from Ukraine because the victory plan that President Zelensky brought with him to the United States met a stony reception there from all of the people that Zelensky met with, including people like Biden, Harris, and of course, Donald Trump. Now, we have had a long article in the Financial Times, as I've said many times, a very, very well connected newspaper. And it too finally acknowledges what ought to have been obvious a long time ago. The title of this article sets it out starkly. Ukraine faces its darkest hour. As he returns home from the United States, President Zelensky must deal with Russian advances, an exhausted society, and the prospect of winter energy shortages. And we have some bitter statements at the beginning. In a command post near the embattled eastern city of Pokrovsk, soldiers of the separate presidential brigade bemoaned the dithering in Washington about whether Kiev can use Western missiles to strike targets inside Russia. If only we were able to fight with both hands instead of with one hand tied behind our back, Ukraine's plucky troops might stand a chance against a more powerful Russian army, laments an attack drone operator. Surrounded by video monitors showing the advancing enemy, the battalion's commander says his objectives have begun to shift. Right now, I'm thinking more about how to save our people. It's quite hard to imagine we will be able to move the enemy back to the borders of 1991. But that is an understatement. Here we can see the enormous damage that the whole story, the whole narrative about the use of Western missiles to attack Russia, deep inside Russia, the enormous damage that that has done. Because, of course, the Pentagon is telling everybody, and I've no doubt that this is true, and commentaries have appeared even in the British media confirming it, that authorizing missile strikes into Russia is not going to make any difference on the battlefronts, that the Russians have already adjusted to that possibility, that the number of missiles is too few to make a significant difference, that the Russians, of course, have the best air defense system in the world. They have massive capacity in terms of electronic warfare and therefore jamming of missiles. The fact, presumably, that you'd have to use ground mapping to send the storm shadows on their way would presumably give the Russians fairly clear ideas of what the routes of these missiles was likely to be, and they could probably deploy their air defense missiles in preparation for that. That's just my guess, by the way. But anyway, one way or the other, the Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are being fed a lie on top of all of the other many lies they have been told over the course of this war. They've been told that Western artillery systems, the M777s and the Caesar howitzers and all of those would transform the situation on the battlefronts. They were told that Western tanks, the Leopard 2s, the Challenger 2s, and the Abrams tanks would transform the situation on the battlefront. That turned out to be completely wrong. All of these tanks proved too heavy, too cumbersome to use on the Ukrainian battlefronts. By the way, even I, who have no experience in military matters, but who have some knowledge of logistics, pointed out that this was likely to be the case, that these huge hulking machines seem to me incredibly ill-adapted to the Ukrainian landscape. And so it has turned out the Soviet-era tanks that the Ukrainians previously had were more appropriate for this landscape. Just saying. Anyway, the Western tanks failed. Then, of course, we were told about the HIMARS missiles. They were going to be decisive. It apparently took 6 weeks for the Russians to adjust to them. They now regularly jam the GPS guidance of these missiles, making them far less effective than they had been previously. The small diameter bomb that was installed on them proved ineffective, and the Russians have, through massive saturation drones, been able to track and observe where all of these HIMARS are. And over the last few months, we have seen a mass destruction of HIMARS launchers right across the Ukrainian battlefield. And we were told that the Ukrainians would have this enormous advantage in drones. A year ago, I remember reading in the media in the West about all of the AI-guided drones that the Ukrainians were going to use, which were going to be impervious to Russian jamming. Well, those AI drones have never appeared. At least I'm not aware of them if they have. Ukrainian drones have been swamped by far greater numbers of Russian drones, where the Russians can still jam all of Ukraine's drones. The Russians have developed drones which are guided through fiber optic cables. One of the consequence of that, by the way, is that the definition from the images provided by the ongoing cameras on these drones is of exceptional quality, just saying. But anyway, these drones with their fiber optic cables, they are jam proof, and they have been causing significant damage to the Ukrainians in various parts of the battlefronts now. And the Russians recently have started to deploy their Orion drones, their equivalent of the Reapers and the Predators, to the Ukrainian battlefields. And, well, they're being used very effectively as well. And the Ukrainians were also told that Western air defense missiles, the Patriots and the NASAMS and the IRIS-Ts, that they would transform the situation in the air. Well, to all intents and purposes, even after deliveries of all of these systems, there is now scarcely any air defense operating over the skies, in the skies over Ukraine anymore. We see Russian missiles and Russian drones operating almost without any counter, and they're able to attack Ukrainian positions right across the battlefronts. Even in Kiev, which used to be the best defended location, it seems that Russian missiles now regularly get through. I've, by the way, received a personal account from an eyewitness who's been to Kiev, and he described that very thing. He said that during the night you can actually see the Russian missiles strike, and as for the Patriots, well, they're nowhere to be seen or heard. They basically disappeared from the skies over Kiev. And, of course, the last one was the ATACMS missiles. They were supposed to transform the situation. They were going to lead to a blockade of Crimea itself, or the entry points into Crimea were going to be closed by massive strikes by ATACMS missiles. The Russian Black Sea Fleet was going to be destroyed as a result of the ATACMS missile strikes. None of that has happened. Most of the ATACMS, the vast majority of them, were shot down by the Russian air defenses. And the ATACMS has made scarcely any difference at all to the overall situation in Crimea or the Black Sea, with the Russians having finished construction of their railway lines. The Russian logistics in Crimea have never been better. By the way, I'm now going to push back even further and say that the Russians have effectively won the battle for the Black Sea. I appreciate that this contradicts completely the prevailing Western narrative that British Storm Shadow missiles drove back the Russian Black Sea Fleet, effectively pushed it away from Crimea, sank it. It's clear that isn't the case. The Black Sea Fleet seems to be operating pretty much as normal. And I read an article in the Daily Telegraph which complains angrily about the presence of sea mines in the western Black Sea, interfering with merchant shipping there. I'm not by any means sure, by the way, who has planted those mines, those sea mines. The Ukrainians have in the past deployed sea mines in the Black Sea, but maybe it was the Russians. Anyway, one way or the other, the person straightforwardly acknowledges, he's a former naval officer, that these sea mines could also prevent Ukrainian grain ships from passing through the Black Sea, a fact which, as far as I'm concerned, further confirms a point I have made many times. If the Russians had really intended to impose a naval blockade on Odessa, on Ukrainian merchant shipping, they had all the means to do so. They could have used their aircraft to drop bombs on the ships. They could have used anti-ship missiles to do the same thing. They could have just used cheap naval mines to do it also. They haven't done it because they have not wanted to impose that kind of blockade, because they know perfectly well that their friends in the global south would be very unhappy about the interruption of Ukrainian grain and food exports at a time when there is high worldwide inflation, especially involving food products. So there we go. All of these weapons, and they failed. And now Ukrainian soldiers are being fed the next lie, that in fact, if the missiles can be unleashed on Russia itself, that will deliver victory. The cruelty of this constant raising of hopes, false hopes, the cruelty of it astonishes me. But anyway, we're then told by the Financial Times that the Ukrainians, even the Ukrainian soldiers, no longer believe that the war can be won. One of them, who's called Yuri, another commander on the Eastern Front, says he fears the prospect of a forever war. I am for negotiations now, he added, expressing concern that his son, also a soldier, could spend much of his life fighting, and that his grandson might one day inherit an endless conflict. If the US turns off the spigot, we're finished, says another officer, a member of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade in nearby Kurachovo. He's one of the lucky ones. He's not in Vuhledar, where the 72nd Brigade is in the process of being destroyed. And then we're told Ukraine is headed into what is maybe its darkest moment of the war so far. It is losing on the battlefield in the east, with Russian forces advancing relentlessly. And then we're told, albeit at an immense cost in men and equipment. But then we have no actual corroboration of this. As I've discussed many times, the media zona reports do not really support that conclusion. And I made my comment yesterday about how I thought that Simplicius the thinker was overestimating Ukrainian losses. I thought his figure, 320,000 killed in action, was too high. Inevitably, I got all kinds of responses from various people. And there was one response which pointed to a Russian project. Now, I want to stress it's a Russian project which attempts to reproduce Mediazona's methodology. And they claim that on the basis of open source reporting, of obituary notices, of funerals, of the expansion of Ukrainian cemeteries, of all of that kind of thing, well, they give a figure for Ukrainian losses, and I mean now killed in action, of around 500,000. Now, I still find that difficult to believe, but anyway, that's the information that these people are giving. As I said, they are a Russian project. Maybe they're overstating things. Maybe they are engaging in what one might call wishful thinking, though I would scarcely wish death on that kind of scale. But what evidence do we really have that Russian losses, are being incurred at an immense cost in men and equipment? The media's owner reports, on the contrary, suggest that Russian losses continue on, relatively speaking, a downward curve. Just saying. And that's what one would expect, given that the situation on the battlefronts is becoming easier for the Russians as Ukrainian strength ebbs and as Russian strength grows. And then we're told, this is again by the Financial Times, Ukraine is struggling to restore its depleted ranks with motivated and well-trained soldiers, while the arbitrary military mobilization system is causing real societal tension. It also is facing a bleak winter of severe power and potentially heating outages. And then we have a comment from the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament, Alexander Merezhko, society is exhausted. And then we get to the discussion about negotiations. And we're told that a Ukrainian official in Kiev said most players want de-escalation here. And by players, he means the Western powers. We have a comment from Jeremy Shapiro, head of the Washington office of the European Council on Foreign Relations, who says straightforwardly, we are losing the war. And the Biden administration are thinking of how to move that war to a greater quiescence. Notice that word, greater quiescence. Not end the war, but somehow move it to a greater quiescence. Then there's all sorts of comments about the worries about what Donald Trump might do if he's elected. And we're also told that Zelensky's victory plan wasn't really a victory plan after all. Rather, it was more a device to try to strengthen Ukraine's position in advance of negotiations that everybody now knows is coming. And, well, then we start to come to the absolute real situation. We're told that despite the brave words about victory, despite resistance, continuing resistance from Ukrainian society to the idea of territorial concessions, the only realistic way to end the war is to accept territorial concessions. Multiple European diplomats who attended the UN General Assembly in New York say there was a tangible shift in tone and content of discussions around the potential settlement. They note more openness from Ukrainian officials to discuss the potential for agreeing a ceasefire even while Russian troops remain on their territory, and more frank discussions among Western officials about the urgency for a deal. And we're told that Andrei Subiga, Ukraine's new foreign minister, used private meetings with Western officials on his first trip to the United States to discuss potential compromise solutions. Notice the word compromise solutions. And that there's a major change, and we're told that we're talking more and more openly about how this ends and what Ukraine would have to give up in order to get a permanent peace deal, says one of the diplomats who was present in New York. And that's a major change from even 6 months ago when this kind of talk was taboo. Now, notice immediately one of the problems, and it takes us back to that incredibly insightful comment made by Eve Smith. Well, I think it was about a year ago now, though she's made it several times since then, which is that the Western powers spent all their time before a negotiation discussing and in effect negotiating with each other about what position, what stance to take at the negotiations, what their proposal going forward is going to be. And as a result, they completely lose sight of the opinions of the other side. Now, why would the Russians be interested in a compromise at this point of the war? I mean, just let's ask that very simple question. They're winning. They've absorbed everything that the West can throw at them. Every single weapon system. I've discussed all the various weapon systems. Every single sanctions. The sanctions have been a complete failure, as even people in the United States are now starting to concede. They are winning on the battlefronts. They have either captured or are about to capture Vuhledar. They're likely to capture before long. In fact, they're certain to capture before long Kurachovo, Toretsk, Selidovo, and almost certainly Pakrovsk and Chasiv Yar. They are probably going to entrap the Ukrainians in Kursk region, inflicting on the Ukrainians a Dien Bien Phu-like disaster there. Why would the Russians be interested in compromise? What is this nonsense about compromise? Getting the Russians to agree to some sort of compromise. Anyway, let's just push on and see the further descent into unreality. And we're told about the enormous problems with the energy system, that it's likely, in fact, it's certain, that there's going to be massive power shortages across Ukraine in the winter. And of course, a Ukrainian winter is a grim thing. Temperatures fall very low. We're told about the abusive nature of the Ukrainian mobilization processes. A Ukrainian commentator, Gleb Vyshlinsky, director of the Center for Economic Strategy in Kiev, talks about the mobilization in these terms. He says it is perceived as abusive, worse than if you are a criminal, whether it's at least due process. It tears people apart. The real enemy is Russia, but at the same time, they fear a corrupt, abusive enrollment office doing the worst things. So, terrible mobilization process. And of course, we've already read, the article has already told us about how the soldiers, that this mobilization, this abusive and corrupt mobilization process, the soldiers it is producing, lack motivation and are unable to fight. In fact, there have been more articles which have appeared in various places and more comments by Ukrainian officers talking about how recently mobilized Ukrainian troops are simply not prepared to go into battle and to fight in the way that the Ukrainian veterans of the war, those who were called up in 2022, are still prepared to do. And then we are told that despite everything, despite the fact that there is a grudging and gradual acceptance within Ukrainian society, and all this is based on Ukrainian opinion polls, which I would argue, always come with a health warning, but of course, Western commentators and journalists never see that. We're then told that negotiations might nonetheless be needed. And then we come back again to Eve Smith's point, because it's clear when you read this article that the sticking point for the West remains NATO membership. NATO membership remains Ukraine's key goal, but very few of the alliance's 32 members think it is possible without a full lasting ceasefire and a defined line on the map that determines what portion of Ukraine's territory the alliance's mutual defence clause applies to. And then we're told all about West Germany and the German variant. And we're told that the West German model is gaining traction, particularly in the White House, which has been the most skeptical about NATO membership. The Russians would hate that, but it at least could be some opening gambit for a compromise. And they're then told that bringing in any part of Ukraine into NATO would, quote, this is again from the Financial Times article, require a vast force deployment by the US and its partners that any US administration, Democratic or Republican, would likely balk at, given Washington's focus on the threat from China. And one question would be whether European partners would be willing to shoulder more of the burden. The answer would be, by the way, would be no to that. Incidentally, I remember before the special military operation began, Anatol Lieven making exactly that point in Responsible Statecraft, that to defend Ukraine, or indeed to defend Eastern Europe in the event that we were to go back into the kind of Cold War scenario that existed between 1945 and 1989, would require the United States to deploy forces in Europe at an immense scale, which it is no longer able to afford, especially given the competing demand on its resources from Russia. I have spoken many times about the resource trap that the United States is facing, the fact that it is now confronting adversaries on multiple fronts in a way that it did not during the Cold War, and that its resources are not equal to that kind of challenge. But anyway, still we have this discussion about NATO membership, and still this idea about, let's bring in part of Ukraine into NATO and, see whether the Russians can be brought to accept that. And there is, at least in this article, some acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the Russians might say no. And the question is put in as a question, it's posed as a question. And would Russia accept Ukraine's entry into the alliance? An alignment with the West it has been trying to thwart militarily for a decade. Many on both sides of the Atlantic say it is unlikely. The Russians have said categorically no. Surely that ought to be the end of the matter. If the Russians said no before the special military operation began, if they told Bill Burns, the US ambassador to Moscow back in 2008, that it was a red line that must not be crossed, if they've gone to war to prevent it, which is what the special military operation ultimately is all about, why would they concede on this in any shape or form now that they are winning? Just saying. And, we are then told that there is another problem. We are nonetheless told that land for NATO membership is the only game in town. Everyone knows it, says one senior Western official. Nobody will say it out loud, but it's the only strategy on the table. The only strategy on the table. A strategy which we're told many people in NATO already know that the Russians will reject. And if the Russians reject it, what then? What exactly does the West do in that kind of situation? Well, we also have admissions that getting Ukraine to agree to any kind of compromise might provoke a crisis in Ukraine itself. We're told repeatedly in the West that Ukraine is a democracy, that it follows rule of law, that there are no real extremists or radicals of any kind in Ukraine. Well, clearly, the authors of this article know otherwise. The biggest domestic problem for Zelensky might come from a nationalist minority opposed to any compromise, some of whom are now armed and trained to fight. If you get into any negotiation, it could be a trigger for social instability, says a Ukrainian official. Zelensky knows this very well. There will always be a radical segment of Ukrainian society that will call any negotiation capitulation. The far right in Ukraine is growing. The right wing is a danger to democracy, said Mereshko, who is an MP for Zelensky's Servant of the People Party. Well, it might surprise some of the readers of the Financial Times that there is a far right in Ukraine. When we read about the far right in Britain, it's always the far right in other countries, in Germany, in France, in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Spain, and now, of course, in Austria, where a party, the Freedom Party, which we call far right, has just come first in the parliamentary elections. But it turns out that there is one in Ukraine as well, and it turns out that it is a problem. These people are motivated, and they're armed, and they will reject any compromise, and they are in threat to the country's internal stability. Of course, if you have been watching the Duran, if you have been watching these programs, if you have been watching programs by people like Brian Beletic, David Davis, all sorts of people like this, none of this will be new to you. If you've read articles by people like Anatol Lieven, Paul Robinson, Jeff Roberts, if you read Strana, the Ukrainian news magazine, which is based outside Ukraine, again, none of this would be new to you. But it's a problem which Western governments have never confronted. They've pretended it doesn't exist. And now suddenly, as they realize that they're going to lose the war, they want some kind of negotiation to begin, even though the terms that they're talking about are absurd ones. Terms the Russians are going to categorically reject. Well, suddenly we learn that there is this problem of the far right in Ukraine and the fact that these people are well armed, though notice that the Financial Times doesn't mention the fact that they're well armed and organized in distinct brigades, military brigades, which form part of the Ukrainian armed forces. And, by the way, as I understand it, receive preferential treatment in terms of arms, ammunition, and supplies. So there we are. This is the best, apparently, that the West can do at the moment. They're all talking with each other. They're discussing what to do. They understand that the war is lost. I have said in recent programs that the Ukrainians realized that the war was lost in July. And I said that over the last few weeks, sometime I think this month, in September, as the news from the battlefronts, from Vuhledar and Kurachovo and Toretsk and Pokrovsk began to trickle in, as it became clear that the Kursk operation is turning into a disaster. At some point then, the West realized that Ukraine is losing the war. When the West realized that the problems with the $50 billion loan were all but insuperable, when the West realized that the Ukrainian energy system is on the brink of collapse, and that the West's hopes of re-equipping Ukraine with air defense systems so as to save Ukraine from Russian bombardment, that was a fantasy. At that point, sometime over the last couple of weeks, the realization finally dawned that the war in Ukraine is lost, and they're scrabbling around trying to think of what to do. Notice that this article does not mention what the Russians have said their terms for ending the war are. The Russians have actually set out their terms for ending the war very clearly. It is Istanbul plus. Putin said that in June. It's been reaffirmed several times since. The Ukrainians must pull out of the four regions: Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, abandon any idea of reoccupying these territories, when that means, by the way, ceding the entire city of Zaporozhye. They must agree to be neutral. The idea of NATO membership is completely ruled out. The idea that you can come along and propose that part of Ukraine remain in NATO as part of some negotiating gambit is going to meet with absolute scorn from the Russian side. And the Russians, and this has been repeatedly stated recently by people like Lavrov and Putin, they insist on internal changes in Ukraine to protect Russian speakers, the Russian language, the Russian Orthodox Church, all of these things. All the things that this radical nationalist minority that the Financial Times has suddenly discovered, these people who belong to the far right, these people who are angry and armed and motivated and who will treat any negotiation as surrender, things that these people are certain to reject. So there we are. That is where we are in the West today. There is no clear strategy. There is no plan on how to end the war. Zelensky doesn't have one. He came up with proposals for a victory plan, which everybody knows is ridiculous. The West is absorbed with fantasies about the partition of the Germanies. Anybody who is familiar with the history of the 1940s and 1950s will know how completely different that situation was from the one that we are seeing in Ukraine today. The Soviet Union did not go to war with Germany in 1941 to prevent Germany joining NATO. To put it very simply, the division of Germany was the product of an Allied victory. And though the Allies then fell out with each other, it was the product also, the division was also the product of a German defeat. There is no conceivable situation where one can make any sort of parallels between that situation and the one we are seeing in Ukraine today. And the Russians have continued to reaffirm, I believe Putin has in fact just said as much, though I've not yet found his exact words, that the Russians will continue with the special military operation until all its objectives are achieved, and none of these objectives are conceded in this article, accepting that the Russians will remain in occupation of part of Ukraine and thinking that Ukraine can walk away with all of the rest is not a plan to end the war. It is a plan to prolong it and to prepare the ground for Ukraine's complete defeat. Anyway, there we are. That's this article in the Financial Times. Let's quickly turn to the situation in the Middle East. The first thing to say is, as I said, there is some kind of ground operation underway by Israel in Lebanon, the scale of which I find impossible at the moment to gauge. Hezbollah is still in existence. They're continuing to launch missiles and rockets at Israel. They apparently again targeted a Mossad facility near Tel Aviv. There are some reports that this time, definitely, some of the missiles did get through and have inflicted some casualties on Israel. At least that is what the reports say. I have seen no corroboration, and it could be that these reports are wrong. Yesterday, I said that there were divisions amongst the Americans, that the Pentagon predominantly opposed the operation in Lebanon, that the US administration was going at least through the motions of trying to agree a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. But now, surprise, surprise, we learn that even as one part of the American government was proposing ceasefires to the Iranians and to Hezbollah, and apparently trying to persuade the Israelis to agree to that ceasefire, other US officials, members of the White House team, in other words, people who advised the president himself, White House aides, were privately urging Prime Minister Netanyahu along. They were telling him to go ahead, do what he wanted to do against Hezbollah, and the United States would fully back it. And by the way, those White House aides have proved exactly right, despite all of the protestations and denials and pretenses, if you prefer to use that word, that the United States was caught by surprise. We're now having statements from US officials that, in fact, all along, that they now support what Israel is trying to do in Lebanon. What that is, by the way, what exactly the Israelis are trying to do in Lebanon, I am not sure. It could be to push all the way to the Litani River, but then that would, of course, leave them in control or occupation of a territory that they tried to control. They've tried to control before, and they ended up facing an insurgency and severe losses, and eventually they had to retreat. So maybe if they do try to do that, things will repeat themselves. The word at the moment is that these are simply raids that we are seeing, and that no ground invasion as yet is planned. Well, I'm skeptical about that, but we'll see. Anyway, there is disarray clearly on the American and Israeli, well, certainly the American side. There's no disarray on the Israeli side. They are determined, it seems to me, to press on, at least for the moment. As for the Iranian side, there is clearly disarray there. There are arguments apparently now raging between President Pezeshkian and the members of Iran's security elite. President Pezeshkian and his officials have denied clear statements made yesterday by Iranian senior political and military officials that Iran would be sending troops to Lebanon. President Pezeshkian still tries to maintain some kind of policy of restraint, even as he admits, and this is according to The Guardian, that the ground is crumbling underneath him. There is growing criticism of him from within the Iranian establishment. And as I discussed yesterday, it seems to me that his moves, his attempts to seek some kind of rapprochement with the Western powers, have blown up in his face almost as soon as he became president of Iran. I'm going to say something here, by the way, which is that I think that what President Pezeshkian perhaps fails to understand is that in terms of the major players in the Middle East, neither the Israeli hardliners nor the people of the security establishment in Iran want the kind of rapprochement that he is talking about. The confrontation with Iran is beneficial politically to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government. It has enabled them to consolidate support there. And besides, I've no doubt that they believe in it themselves. Whilst in Iran, I think it is some time now that the hardliners in Iran, and they are there, came to the conclusion that negotiations with the West are pointless, that Iran should seek its future elsewhere, specifically by pressing forward with integration with the BRICS and developing its friendships with China and Russia. And given that this is the outlook of the hardliners in Iran and the hardliners in Israel, one can even see why both of them have a common interest in ensuring that President Pezeshkian fails. This isn't something that I say easily, but I believe it is to be true. Anyway, apparently some of President Pezeshkian's officials are complaining that he would, of course, obey an order from the supreme leader. He's not in any kind of rebellion or mutiny against the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. I suspect that it's only a matter of time now before his political authority in Tehran collapses completely and he leaves office and is replaced by a more hardline figure, somebody closer to the spirit and policy of President Pezeshkian's predecessor, Ebrahim Raisi, who, it must be said, strengthened diplomatically, economically, and militarily the position of Iran. Now, all of that leaves open still the question of where this war is going. My own view is that this incursion, if that is what it is only the opening round in what I suspect is now going to become a longer and longer war, one in which the United States, whether it wants to or not, is going to be dragged in. Israel, for its part, seems to be striking out now in all directions. They've conducted missile and bombing strikes against Yemen, the Houthis in Yemen, the Syrians. I talk about an all-out war involving everywhere across the Middle East. We can already see that the first steps towards that are taking place. So, there it is. This is the first scene of the first act in what could be a 5-act play. A long war, a major clash across the Middle East. Of course, there will be a huge amount of diplomatic activity as people try to maneuver for position. The various outside powers, some of them will be drawn in, some of them will try to stay out. China will definitely stay out and will remain there in a position to pick up the pieces. The United States, I can't see how it can avoid being dragged in. And Russia will probably play a significant role on the ground as well. But there it is. The war that looked like it would come in October last year is now upon us. We might get occasional ceasefires and interruptions. But this long period of relative peace, which has existed between the Arabs and the Israelis since the 1982 Lebanon War, interspersed by insurrections on the Palestinian territories, the various intifadas, that, it seems to me, has now ended. Well, That is my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, and also links for all of these under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.